Hello, and welcome to Middle East Focus, a weekly podcast on regional affairs and U.S. policy, produced by the Middle East Institute in Washington, D.C. I'm Alistair Taylor, MEI's editor-in-chief.
And I'm Matthew Czekaj, managing editor at MEI. Another red line has been crossed. On September 9th, Israel carried out a strike in Doha, Qatar. Its target was a meeting of senior Hamas officials who had ostensibly convened to discuss a U.S. ceasefire proposal to end the war in Gaza. Hamas says the strike killed 6 people, including several of its members, along with a Qatari internal security officer, but none of its top leaders. The attack triggered an emergency Arab-Islamic summit whose participants unanimously condemned the Israeli actions. The response from the White House has been mixed, even though Qatar is a key U.S. military and strategic partner in the region.
How might last week's Doha strike further reshape a region in flux? How will it affect U.S.-Israeli relations? What does it say about Israel's ties with the Arab world, 5 years on from the signing of the Abraham Accords? And what does the strike, along with Israel's launch of a ground assault on Gaza City on September 16th, mean for the future of Israeli-Hamas negotiations, in which Qatar was playing a key mediating role? To discuss these issues and more, we're joined by one of our newest colleagues, Dr. Natan Sachs, a senior fellow at the Middle East Institute. From 2012 to 2025, Natan was affiliated with the Brookings Institution, where for the last 8 years, he served as the director of its Center for Middle East Policy.
Our listeners can subscribe to Middle East Focus on Spotify, Apple Podcasts, and other podcast providers, and please check out MEI's other podcasts, Rethinking Democracy, hosted by Ganul Toll, and Taking the Edge Off the Middle East with Brian Katulis.
Natan, thank you for joining us on Middle East Focus.
Thank you so much for having me. It's a pleasure.
So let's dive right in. We're recording this episode on Tuesday, September 16th, a week after the Israeli strike. So there's been a bit of time for the dust to settle. Given everything we know now, was this strike worth it for Israel?
Certainly not, and in several different ways. But the top line is that their goal apparently failed. They did not manage to hit the Hamas leadership, and in particular, the de facto leader of the negotiations, who had left Gaza just before October 7th. He was a close partner of Yahya Sinwar, the mastermind behind October 7th, and himself part of the planning. So he was very much the target for the Israelis, and that apparently failed. We don't know, at least publicly, we don't know much about his whereabouts and how, if he was injured and to what degree. But the reports from Hamas and from the Qataris are that his son was killed and others were killed, but not him. Of course, that's just in the immediate goal, let alone the regional ramifications and also the ramifications for Israeli relations with the United States. Qatar is a very different proposition than other places that Israel has had strikes in the past couple of years, certainly than Syria or Iran or others. Qatar is a very close non-NATO U.S. ally with a huge air base in it and was playing a role in the mediation. Not to put too fine a point on it, the relations with Israel were complex, of course, deeply, deeply strained. Israel views Qatar as, not only Israel, the region in general views Qatar as the main Hamas backer in the Arab world, along with Turkey, really the only ally that Qatar has, and not coincidentally host of the Hamas leadership. But from a strategic point of view, this is certainly something Israel's going to have to deal with for probably a long time.
This came after a series of high-profile Israeli intelligence coups that enabled devastating strikes against Iran and its axis of resistance affiliates. What went wrong this time around?
Well, this is a very different proposition. So Qatar is not part of the Iranian axis. And from the Israeli, if you hear Israelis in private and in public, they will say now that they were not aiming at Qatar at all. They were aiming simply at the Hamas leadership. That these leaders, in particular the ones who were involved with atrocities of October 7th, the difference is partly a matter of luck. There have been many attempts in the past, and this could have succeeded. We don't know the specific operational details. There's been speculation that perhaps the pre-warning, Israel gave the United States at least some warning, and perhaps some of that got to the Qataris in time. Maybe they got the target out. But that is all speculation that honestly we don't know responsibly the details of what happened in that building.
You touched on it a little bit, but maybe you could elaborate on Israel's motivations for carrying out this strike. What were the sort of strategic and political calculations at play here?
Well, the biggest problem among many, the biggest problem here is that the strategic part is what's unclear. So from a tactical operational perspective, they had an opportunity to get these guys, etc. But these guys were not actually very hard targets. So there are other people, taking out Hassan Nasrallah in Lebanon was a dramatic intelligence success, taking out a successor immediately after, and the whole coterie of leaders of Hezbollah, which has had huge ramifications for Lebanon, for Syria. I would say so far extremely positive ramifications for both Lebanon and Syria. In this case, these are not people who are terribly hard to find. And the strategic element of it is sort of lacking. When you talk to Israelis, they will argue that these people were some of the most hardline preventing a deal from happening. That stretches the logic a little bit, since obviously this also hurts negotiations with Qatar as a central mediator because it was backing Hamas. But from a strategic perspective, it's hard to see this specific strike as sort of coinciding with any bigger strategy. One point, though, if you try to think of the Israeli logic, of the many lessons they learned on October 7th, very high on the list is that their errors before that were in relying on deterrence and in trying to accept threats on its border to its civilians, be it from Hezbollah, be it from Hamas, and behind them, certainly behind Hezbollah, Iran, in a reality that they simply could not live with anymore, given what for the Israelis was a simply can never happen again event on October 7th. And because of that, their threshold for risk and their willingness also to cross red lines, as you put it earlier, is very different than it was before. From their perspective, leaders of Hamas who state very clearly, and let's not beat around the bush, these leaders, in particular these leaders, were stating very clearly there will be another October 7th, and that is their plan, that Israel would take them out, and almost without regard to other considerations, wherein lies the failure here, I think. And it coincides with a broader approach, which says that regional dynamic before, where Israel, from its perspective, was sitting surrounded by a ring of fire, an Iranian ring of fire, with Hamas affiliated with it, although not exactly a partner, that was a reality it could not live with anymore, and it was going to change it dramatically in the context of this war.
How was the Doha strike understood by Israelis themselves? I mean, what has been the public reaction to it and the aftermath?
So Israel is an extremely polarized society right now, and it's divided on the war, but it's divided on the war in different terms than many people abroad. Israelis are still very, very focused on what happened on October 7th, much more so than people abroad, in particular because of the hostages. Israel is no longer a very small country, but it feels itself to be a small country, and especially one that is very tight-knit, and one in which mutual assurance and the Commonwealth are sort of very, very strong elements of the Israeli ethos. So when Israelis think of October 7th and the kidnapping of babies and children and grandmothers, it is not merely that the state failed, it clearly failed spectacularly, or that the military failed. Israelis feel that they failed, that they did not protect these children who are their children in some sense. It is much stronger than in many other countries. I think in other countries, people feel shared citizenship and sort of obviously shared fate in some regard. Israelis really view their country to a large degree as a safe haven where they are responsible for one another. And because of that, the hostage question looms extremely large. Most ordinary Israelis can tell you the names of some of the hostages. They certainly know the images, who are simply everywhere in Israel. So the Israelis are divided on whether to prioritize getting the hostages out or to prioritize something which Israelis share, which is a desire to eliminate Hamas as a governing force and a military force in Gaza, which would then carry out another October 7th one day down the road. They, by and large, support both goals, but they prioritize them very differently. And this difference has coincided with the political difference inside Israel that has existed for many years of the pro-Bibi Netanyahu and anti-Bibi camps, with now the pro-Bibi camp prioritizing destroying Hamas and the anti-Bibi camp prioritizing the hostages. It, of course, does not align perfectly, but it has coincided with that. And this has made a real chasm in Israeli society. The attack in Doha, to a certain degree, echoed that, made people who oppose the ground operation in Gaza now, and they are many, they're a majority of Israelis, especially because of the fear for the hostages who are being held as human shields in Gaza City, and led by the parents of those hostages, some of whom know quite specifically that they're being held in Gaza City as now above ground in some cases as human shields. And between them and supporters of the government and the government itself. The Doha strike seemed to be the most overt statement from Netanyahu so far, joining some verbal statements, that he is genuinely prioritizing destroying Hamas to the degree that negotiations and the Qatari mediation and an attempt to release the hostage through negotiations, that will simply take the backseat to his goal. And in that sense, it's a dramatic domestic message as well, of course, beyond the very dramatic diplomatic ones.
Zooming out somewhat, Prime Minister Netanyahu has repeatedly declared over the past 2 years that Israel's aim is to, quote, change the face of the Middle East. In what ways has Israel been trying to reshape the regional order, and in favor of what?
So I think, I mentioned before that they viewed October 7th, there are many different lessons, and Israel, part of the big problem is that Israel has not actually taken the time or the institutional effort to sort of investigate what happened and try to learn. But already on the day of October 7th, Israelis were thinking back to the former huge trauma in Israeli history, which was October 6th, 1973, 50 years and 1 day prior, when the Egyptian and Syrian armies managed to surprise Israel and cross the lines both in the Sinai and in the Golan. That led to a public commission of inquiry, which is sort of a very important institution in Israel. But it also led to Israelis thinking, what was the preconception, the concepция in Hebrew, that blinded Israeli intelligence and its leadership to the possibility of an attack. Then it was estimated that the Israeli success in 1967 made Israelis sure that the Egyptians would not dare strike unless they could counter Israeli air superiority, and that the Syrians would not attack without the Egyptians. The latter part was true. And this caused the intelligence to disregard repeated signals that there might be a strike, that Sadat, the president of Egypt, was planning not another major drill, but rather an attack across the Suez Canal. So already on October 7th, 2023, Israelis are asking, what's the preconception, the conception now? And I mentioned before, some of it was this perception that the enemy can be contained, and in particular, Hamas itself. So Hamas takes over the Gaza Strip in 2007, but it had already been a dominant or an important militia force there before. And since then, in the many long years since then, digging in, creating this historic unprecedented underground system, arming itself, taking advantage, of course, of smuggling and of external funding. And the Israelis confronted in that long time a dilemma of, do they try to take down Hamas, a obviously radical but also committed foe of Israel, given the huge cost that would incur for the Israeli military and also for Gazans. And their decision was always not to. So even in all the different rounds, these were rounds that were not trying to destroy Hamas, not trying to vanquish it, but rather to diminish its capacity and bring back a state of deterrence. And if there was an intelligence preconception here, it's the belief, the very strong belief, that I heard just less than a year before October 7th. In Israel, I heard intelligence officials speaking very clearly about the danger of conflagration in the West Bank, of fear of what happened there, but not in the Gaza Strip, because there they estimated Hamas was A, deterred, and B, Sinwar had convinced them he was interested in rebuilding the Gaza Strip, improving life there, trying to open up. And indeed, there was already 2 or 3 years of consecutive openings up of the limitations on movement in and out of Gaza, especially of goods. The Israelis thought that was working, and that here was a carrot and a stick that Sinwar would take. In a broader sense, that kind of containment, thinking that the enemy is deterred, thinking that you can buy it off with Qatari money. So Netanyahu, for example, got the Qataris to transfer money to Hamas, which Israelis refer to as protection money. And this became one of the big indictments against Netanyahu. This deal with the Qataris to support their protege at Hamas, and this belief that it is deterred and simply wanting to improve lives rather than liberate Palestine in its own vision. So that's in Gaza. And in a broader sense, Israel learned and perhaps overlearned the lesson in a much wider aperture, in that containment, deterrence, that can't work, is particular with its main foe, Iran. So transforming the region from the Israeli perspective meant removing the biggest threat to Israel, which was not Hamas, it was Hezbollah. It meant removing, or at least stalling, the existential threat as the Israelis saw it, which is the nuclear project in Iran. With those two as the highlights, there were some repercussions of that, of course, for Syria, the fall of the Assad regime. There's the fighting with the Houthis, which is a sort of separate theater. But by and large, it was whether or not Israel could push back against the Ring of Fire, predominantly against Hezbollah, and behind it, Iran. What that would create in terms of regional order is still yet to be seen. From the Israeli perspective, it would mean if there's a weak Iran, then the Sunni Arabs on the other side, in particular the Saudis and the Emiratis, would gain, especially those who were fighting in Yemen prior and who feel threatened by Iran. The Qataris in a different camp, because from the Israeli perspective, at least, the Qataris were sort of in the Muslim Brotherhood camp, Turkey and Qatar versus the Emiratis and the Saudis. And so they're therefore perhaps gaining somewhat from the weakening of Iran, but in a very different way. This regional order, in other words, would be a weaker Iran, a less constrained Israel, one in which it would counter any threat that it saw, but not with a clear order of who the landlord would be. To this very long answer, I'll end one last point. The Biden vision, which would have this war end and later Iran weakened in favor of a Saudi-Israeli deal with American patronage, that is in the mindset also of Netanyahu as well. So if you ask him and people around him what would be the regional order, in an ideal scenario, it would include Israeli-Saudi normalization. That would allow for an order without Iranian dominance to the benefit of everyone else, but in particular, these Sunni Arab states and, of course, Israel.
You touched on it earlier that this seems like the strike in Doha seems like a clear sign that Netanyahu is prioritizing the campaign against Hamas at the expense of efforts to get the hostages released. Between the strike on the leadership in Doha, the Hamas leadership in Doha, and the launch of the ground assault in Gaza City, is it fair to say at this point that Israel-Hamas negotiations are kind of dead? Is Qatar likely to continue playing a mediating role, do you think?
Certainly less likely. I don't know exactly what the Qataris would do, and I don't know exactly what Hamas will do. We've certainly seen very strident signals from the Qataris, and we would expect that. I think it's much less likely that they'd be forthcoming now to help Israel with negotiations. That's obvious. But whether or not they would, for example, find understandings with the Americans to try and still play a role is possible. There's also benefit for them. If they can help in truly ending the horror of the war in Gaza, that would also benefit them, so at least from a PR perspective. So I don't know. I think it's certainly extremely risky in that regard. What exactly will happen, I don't know. The negotiations, are they dead? Dead is a big word again. They are in terrible shape, and they're in much worse shape than they were before. The Israeli argument would be that the serious negotiation to really end the war would necessarily include something like the Arab League proposal, plus the Arab League proposal being that Hamas would, after 2 years of everything that has happened in Gaza since it attacked, would actually agree to leave the Gaza Strip, lay down its arms, and release the hostages. The Israelis would say also that Israel would have to have security control there. To say that it's likely that Hamas would do this, no, of course it is not likely. It has shown for 2 years nothing that happens in the Gaza Strip will move it in that direction. But the argument from the Israeli side, and to a certain degree from the Trump administration side, is that this kind of pressure, both the horror we're seeing in Gaza, the attack now, the ground assault now in Gaza City, but also the strike perhaps on the leadership, could be pressure, leverage, as the president likes to say, in that context. The flip side is that the Israelis could agree to Hamas's terms. Could they agree to leaving Hamas in place to at least either govern the Gaza Strip or to at least play a Hezbollah role, meaning someone else would govern the civilian affairs, but they would remain the men with guns. It is not impossible to imagine Israel agreeing to do so in the short term in return to the release of at least the live hostages. It's very hard to see this government in Israel doing so, given how much is vowed not to. And I'll just say that kind of arrangement would not last in the long term. Israel is not about to go back to October 6th and to agree to Hamas ruling a statelet beside it. The terrible tragedy, of course, is that thousands and thousands of people are in the crosshairs of this essential sort of lack of a zone of mutual agreement between the two parties.
Switching gears, I wanted to ask you about a significant discrepancy in the U.S. and Israeli accounts about the strike, specifically when Prime Minister Netanyahu informed President Trump and whether the U.S. had sufficient time to get either Israel to call it off or to warn Qatar. The White House has said it was notified at the last minute when it was basically too late to do anything about it. But according to reporting from Axios from Monday, Israeli sources say Netanyahu called Trump more than 50 minutes before the strike. How significant is that discrepancy in your view, and what does it tell you about the kind of current state of play in U.S.-Israeli relations?
So Barak reported that Axios usually has very good sources and on both sides, actually. And so I think it is fair to assume that there was a real warning. And I say this also because as this happened, and I was here at MEI speaking to some colleagues, I said that Israelis don't do that without at least informing the Americans, in particular because it's Qatar and there's a huge American air base there. And so they would want to give at least fair warning. How much of a warning that is, and is 50 minutes a lot or not, that's a different question. The president may have been informed, and maybe it was not registered exactly where it is or what the significance of the target is or of the host country is. I don't know, and I can't speculate precisely. I think we can assume now that there was warning at least a short time before, and that the Americans did not object in the way that would make Israel call off the strike. Although the means that were used were also ones that would be harder to call off in some regards. This was probably, as reported at least, a air-launched ballistic missile, which is a rather advanced system, and one that could get around a lot of the defenses. It would not go through the airspace of neighboring countries, including Saudi Arabia, and it would also be much harder to stop. Qatar has advanced air defenses purchased from the United States. So in short, we have this, there's some discrepancy here. I'll note that I think it's a bit less than it's made to be. If you listen to the Israelis, they're not saying we didn't warn them. They are officially saying this was an Israeli decision. This is something that we've heard from Netanyahu repeatedly, and we've heard it also from people around him. And to a degree that it seems very clear that is the line that they've chosen. And I think that is a very clear effort, probably agreed with the Americans, that this was an Israeli decision. America is not responsible for this. And is not responsible for the decision to attack a U.S. ally like Qatar. But does that mean that the Americans didn't know ahead of time? No, it does not mean that. It means that it was an Israeli decision, and the Americans did not rule it out. I'll note, President Trump does not love operations that are not successful. This also puts him in a bind, of course, with Qatar, and he cares about the Gulf states, especially the ones that make very major investments. Qatar has done so and has promised a plane and various other things. So this certainly puts the American administration in an awkward position. Again, a gross miscalculation by the Israelis in terms of where they carry this out. I'm not sure the discrepancy is there actually in the fact. It's more in how they're portraying who's responsible for this attack.
There do seem to be some notable parallels with the run-up to the Israeli strikes on Iran in June. In that case, Israel attacked Iran as there was a kind of wait for the sixth round of negotiations with the U.S. over the nuclear program. In this case, Hamas leaders were ostensibly convening to discuss the latest U.S. proposal for a ceasefire in Gaza. What does that suggest about the nature of U.S.-Israeli coordination? And is it evidence of the claim that some have made that the U.S. is outsourcing its Middle East policy to Israel?
I'm not sure it's evidence of that. I think the two cases, they look similar, but they're actually quite different. So in the case of the war between Israel and Iran, or the Israel attack on Iran, the Americans were well aware of the Israeli plan. And I say this in part also because American air defense was very important in that regard against the Iranian ballistic missiles, which are much more damaging and much more threatening to the Israeli civilian population than Hamas's rockets. They caused enormous damage in specific locales where they fell, and shooting them down was crucial. And to do that effectively, Israel needed the coordination of the regional framework that has been put together, and it's been put together mostly under the auspices of the U.S. Central Command, CENTCOM. So the Americans were definitely aware of the Israeli plan there, and I think many have speculated, and I think it's a reasonable assumption that Trump was helping with the ruse, and when there was talk about the new round of negotiations, that the White House had already concluded that Iran was not serious about the negotiations. They've said so many times since, and therefore let the Israelis try what they can. When it was very successful, the United States also decided to join on the last day and do something that the Israelis could not do. In this case, it's very different. Again, the negotiations were not going anywhere, just to be clear, or anywhere is too strong. But what I described before about the impasse still remained. Hamas is unwilling to leave the Gaza Strip. It's been very clear. It doesn't matter what happens to the people above ground, it is not leaving. And Israel it's been very clear, Netanyahu has been made very clear, is not willing to end the war so long as Hamas is dug in with guns, and even in the context of the hostages. So, do I wish it were different? Yes, I do. And I think there are many in Israel, as I said before, who would argue that Israel should conclude a partial deal or even a longer deal to end this war, knowing that the long generational war with Hamas obviously is not over. But I don't think, despite that the Americans were expecting in some big strategic way this strike. This strike was a much smaller affair from the Israeli mindset, and also in real terms, than the war with Iran, obviously, and obviously a far less well thought out plan.
Secretary of State Marco Rubio was in Israel this week, which he visited before heading on to Qatar. If there is a broader disagreement between Netanyahu and Trump about the Doha strike, it was certainly kept well behind closed doors from their public comments. Rubio expressed strong support for Israel and suggested that a diplomatic solution to the war in Gaza may not be possible, that the only pathway to ending the war would be for Hamas to free the hostages and surrender. What were your takeaways from his visit?
I thought it was interesting that we did not see the sort of what seems to be a rather dramatic disagreement over the strike in Doha come to the surface. That was important. I was also struck by things that were not said. In particular, there is, given now the push in the United Nations, and the General Assembly will convene soon for recognition of Palestinian state by quite a few different actors, there's a push in Israel to now resurface the old plan to annex at least parts of the West Bank, to formally annex, not only in practice. And this, of course, is a red flag for many, including the Emiratis. The Abraham Accords that the Emiratis led were at least framed in the context of preventing Israeli de jure annexation, and required indeed postponement, at least, of this annexation. Where the Americans are on this is a question. And so I think very interesting is less what they said in public, but more what was said in private there. I don't think it's a done deal at all that Israel will go forward with annexation, in part because of American objections, if there were any, and Emirati objections that are very public. And this, I think, was very important. Aside from that, we do see a very consistent line. It's consistent for Rubio from the days he was senator, but is also very consistent with this administration, which is a very close embrace of Israel in many different regards. And Rubio made all the sounds that you would expect from Trump's Secretary of State coming to show love for Israel. We did not see a rebuke. And so I think the speculation or hope by many of some enormous rift, at least at the moment, we're not seeing that, despite the very real disagreement about the Doha strike, obviously.
At the same time that Rubio was in Israel, Qatar was hosting an emergency Arab-Islamic summit, which was aimed at discussing the Doha strike and crafting a united regional response. What was your read on what came out of it?
So I think that's a very interesting one, and the short answer is that I don't know yet. So, at first, I think all of us take with a big grain of salt some of the declarations. I don't expect an Arab NATO to counter Israel actually to emerge from this just yet. We've heard of that a few times in the past, and it was tried in 1967. I don't expect that to emerge. But nonetheless, we did see a lot of solidarity, and I think very interesting was the intra-Gulf solidarity with the Emiratis and the Saudis there very clearly. And the Egyptians also taking a rather central and vocal role there. These are all the states that Israel thinks of as partners for its vision of the future region. And in that regard, at least on the diplomatic side, a big warning sign for Israel of the ramifications of such a strike for its plans. The Israelis, these lessons that they learned on October 7th, they also overlearned them in some cases dramatically. And so the lack of constraint in pursuing some of these goals, some of the lessons make sense. And certainly I think the diminution of Hezbollah and of the Iran power were risky, were also extremely beneficial for many in the region. This case is a very different one, in particular because it touches on precisely the partners that Israel wants for the day after the Iranian, ascendance in the region. Not that Iran is going away, of course, it's still there and will be back. So that's notable. I think the Emirati-Saudi solidarity with Qatar is notable. The strident sounds that we heard from Egypt, which of course has the first peace treaty with Israel and is Israel's giant neighbor. to put a grain of salt on it, and this is sort of the Middle East analyst professional requirement. Words are important. The Sisi government and Sisi military have had extremely close cooperation with Israel on not just the operational level, but the tactical level. Unprecedented, more than Mubarak. And the Emiratis, of course, now have full relations with the Israelis, much warmer than many other countries, despite the past 2 years and all the horror we've seen. So this is a very important signal, but we don't know yet if it's empty words or if it actually means more in practical terms. And the Israelis have a history since the day Israel was declared of hearing how they're about to be destroyed on the diplomatic side. So we'd have to see how it actually boils down in terms of actions. And I would just caution Egypt and even the UAE and Jordan and many others, their relations with Israel are not actually done as a favor to Israel. It's not altruism. They're doing it because they think it's good for them. And so whether they change that or not is an open question. I think we'll have to wait and see. This certainly risks it from the Israeli perspective, which is part of why this was a reckless move. But the jury is still very much out. I would, again, take a big grain of salt to diplomatic declarations and conferences.
Yeah, to get into specifics in some sense, I mean, one of the questions here, which all this raises, is the regional air defense shield. We saw the way that some of the Arab countries played a role in shooting down missiles or drones coming from Iran at Israel last year, also this past June. So I guess this raises the question, what do you think the chances are that the Arab countries will stick their necks out again next time?
So it's a good question. I think it touches exactly on this point of favors. So if they were sticking their neck out for Israel, I think this might have ended that. They're not. I think they are doing it very much for their own interests. And if anything, in the past 2 years, the irony is, despite all the huge public anger towards Israel and also towards many of these rulers for nascent or existing relations with Israel, we've seen them stick to the Abraham Accords so far. Maybe this will change things. And not only that, but stick and very much enhance the CENTCOM-led security architecture, and in particular, the very close and very quick collaboration on missile defense, sort of the air shield. We should remember some of the major Arab countries in this regard, the Emirates, certainly Saudi Arabia, when they think of this, they're not thinking of Iranian missiles towards Israel. They're thinking about the attacks on Abqaiq. They're thinking attacks on their own territory from Yemen or from Iran itself. That is absolutely about protecting their own skies. And they're looking at CENTCOM but also at Israel itself with its capacity as a building block of their own security. So to the degree that it's a favor to Israel, I think they would not stick their neck out anymore. I don't think that's why they're doing it. It, of course, risks it, and of course doesn't help when Israel's attacking one of the countries that is part of this CENTCOM arrangement and is under the CENTCOM AOR and hosts a giant airbase. It certainly doesn't help that. But again, I would just caution, it's not favors unto Israel, and it is... And declarations on the diplomatic side are very, very different from the collaboration that often happens on the less public side, especially as it relates to security and intelligence. For many of these countries, the security cooperation has yielded enormous dividends in thwarting attacks that we just don't talk about, we don't hear about. And that often comes from Israeli intelligence or from the combination of Israeli and other intelligence via the Americans or via others. Before they give this up, I think they'd have to be convinced it's in their interest to give it up.
It is hard to avoid noting the symbolism, though, of the fact that this summit in Qatar was held on the the 5th anniversary of the signing of the Abraham Accords.
Yeah, absolutely. And this absolutely risks it. And not only that, if you look at the adding the annexation question now, which has really gained traction in Israel, and with senior ministers, especially Bezalel Smotrich from the very, very far right, who's the minister of finance, which is a very important role, but also has a very important role in administration of the West Bank, which is part of what he's done is worse damage in my mind. This question is very central for the Emiratis because thwarting annexation back when the Abraham Accords was signed was a very central PR move for the Emiratis, and sort of they saw that as cover in a public, which is extremely hostile to Israel, obviously, to sign these accords. So when you combine the two, it is very, very risky from the Israeli perspective. And on the public side, coinciding with everything that's happened in the last 2 years, This could hardly be more negative. My caution is just when we're looking at how these things evolve, the public is important. It's not meaningless, but it is less than half the story. And we have to wait and see what exactly the country's view is their own interest.
Prime Minister Netanyahu has said that Israel is entering a kind of isolation. It will be forced to adapt its economy to this new reality. And he's also promised that Israel would become a mixture of Athens and Super Sparta in the region, his words. Clearly, the Israeli leadership sees which way the winds are blowing, and it's trying to prepare the population for something. We've already talked about this shrinking appetite among Arab states to pursue normalization with Israel, this cooling on the Abraham Accords among some of the signatories. Now the EU, the European Union, is preparing to pass a sanctions package this week, potentially. And we could also mention that on Tuesday, the UN Commission of Inquiry's report concluded that Israel committed genocide in Gaza. So with all of this, if Israel were to become isolated, more isolated regionally and internationally, how long can Israel economically survive such a situation?
So it could survive for a long time, but Israel, in terms of its standard of living, anything close to what it was at least before the war, it's important to remember Israel is essentially an economic island. It has relations with Jordan and Egypt, which neighbor it, but in terms of trade, those are very small relations. The peace is very cold peace, and there's not that much trade. Where there was more trade was with Turkey, which is not an immediate neighbor, but that has also declined in the past 2 years. So Israel, to a large degree, operates like an economic island, and international trade, especially with the European Union and with the United States, are very important. There's now new tariffs in the United States, but these relations with the European Union and with constituent states of the European Union is very consequential. So I'd like to unpack a little bit. So when Netanyahu was speaking at a conference of the finance ministry, actually, and he then clarified very quickly. He sort of apparently regretted saying these words because they got a lot of traction, and he tried to clarify that this would be about arms sales, that Israel would have to be able to manufacture its own arms in the future, in particular if there were arms embargoes from Europe. We've seen Spain now talk about not allowing shipments to pass through the Straits of Gibraltar, and the possibility, no less, that the United States may cut its aid. So the American aid in terms of numbers, although it's big numbers and it's a lot of money, the numbers themselves are not what helps Israel dramatically. What really helps Israel is access to American arms. So if that changed, and I don't expect that in this administration may not sign another MOU like Obama did, a Memorandum of Understanding for aid for the next 10 years, and it's due soon. But it may not do that because of the Trump worldview about aid and about trade relations in general. But I don't expect this administration to cut access to arms, but other countries might. So Netanyahu was trying to speak about that, and his argument was actually a more domestic one. It was that Israel will have to build an enormous arms industry, therefore, and to do so, it would have to cut through red tape. And it was more about a, again, very polarizing move by Netanyahu against the bureaucracy and the limitations of the legal advisors of different ministries in his government, and against the legal apparatus writ large. It's a very big deal, but it's a little different than what it sounded, I think, in translation. However, Israelis also listened and heard what you heard and I heard, which is that Israel is facing a dramatic diplomatic isolation now, especially because of Gaza and especially because of the horrific lack of food coming in, to the degree that this affects trade of other countries to Israel, both in official sanctions but also in unofficial cooling of trade. If tourism becomes far less popular, even just in a soft way, if cooperation of companies, if they think twice, do we really want to cooperate with an Israeli company now? Do we need that headache, even if it's legal in their country? This could have a dramatic effect on what is still a small-ish, it's not that small, but a medium-sized economy, and one that is very heavy dependent on trade. And here's the grain of salt, which I have to give. The Israeli economy, nonetheless, has seen attempts of BDS long before Gaza, of course, and is actually relatively well adapted to dealing with these kinds of boycotts, in part because for the majority of Israel's history, it faced not only a direct boycott from the Arab states, but an indirect one. So for many years until 1993, there were many even consumer products that you couldn't find in Israel. And of course, the consumer products are not what matters. What matters is more inputs into industry and the ability to trade. This meant that Israeli industry adapted and evolved to be able to deal with this kind of boycott in ways that many other countries cannot, even ones that are economic islands like Israel. It included dealing with many countries that had no relations with Israel via intermediaries or with international associates. Could be Israeli businesses in India that then also deal with Malaysia or Indonesia, even if there were no direct relations. And a lot of the Israeli advancement in recent years was in the more high-tech and software side of things, and more recently in arms sales. In the high-tech, those are far less susceptible to boycotts. Transferring them sometimes is a matter of bits on the internet rather than any goods that are shipped anywhere. And arms, perhaps ironically, there's been an uptick in sales, exports of arms, because of the demonstration of what it was able to do. So all that to say, this would have a huge effect on an Israeli consumer. But I think some people have this sort of image, or maybe fantasy for some, of they will strangle Israel economically and it is simply out of existence. That's not about to happen. Israel has suffered many, many decades of boycotts, and certainly armed boycotts from the United States and from others, and it survived it. But it would be a very different Israel. It would affect the politics dramatically. It would affect its outlook. It would affect many, many things.
Could you get into the politics question a little bit here? How would that translate?
Sure. So, an Israel that is economically not successful is counter to a very central point of that Netanyahu has been selling for many years. And Netanyahu viewed himself to a certain degree as the strongest advocate of free market economic policy in Israel. 2003, he was Minister of Finance and led some very dramatic reforms in that regard. But his speech here on this regard was, to a certain degree, an admission of failure. Admission of failure as Mr. Diplomacy, certainly, but also an admission of failure on the economic side because of what it would lead to. The problem is, from a political perspective, and it is common to, I think, many countries around the world, including maybe this one, is that the same evidence can be complete proof of whatever you believe in this day and age. So opponents of Netanyahu, critics of Netanyahu, are extremely critical of Netanyahu. It's really hard to exaggerate that. And they view this as evidence of his failure. On the day after October 7th, the world sees what Hamas actually is about, or at least most people did, and some people later denied. But most people saw what actually it's about. And there was enormous goodwill towards Israel, even from places you would not ever imagine. And here it is almost 2 years later, and his policy, among other things, has led to where he is now. So clear evidence of his failure. But to his supporters, Netanyahu did not promise them, sunshine and rainbows. He promised blood, sweat, and tears, just as his idol Churchill did. And he, even in this speech, made very clear it is not because of him or any policy he did. This is because of the internal politics in other countries. And, of course, he's very smart, and some of what he's arguing has some grain of truth. It is not the whole truth, but it has some grain of truth, and it rings very true to his supporters. So when they hear about the troubles ahead, they have a very different view of what has happened in the last 2 years. And when they see the vociferous criticism of Israel, they interpret it as bigotry. It also helps that a lot of bigots have joined in. But they do not see any valid criticism because they have seen a very different reality in the last 2 years. They have mostly seen the story of their hostages. So could this affect Israeli politics in the slightly longer term if the economy goes bad? Absolutely, in dramatic ways. Would it affect Netanyahu in elections that are scheduled about 13 or 14 months from now, 13 and a half months from now? Perhaps, but that's very soon. Israel is traumatized still from the October 7th, but also from this war, and a lot of other things can lead in. He is behind in the polls right now, so he could certainly lose, but we should definitely not count him out. He's a master politician, and we will not know until after the elections, and even then it will take some time probably. So yes, this could hurt him. In the short term, does it or does it not? I'm not smart enough to tell.
We're running short on time here, but before we wrap up, I wanted to kind of get your final thoughts on where you see things going and any other final thoughts you want to leave our audience with.
About a year ago, someone said that we lived through a decade of events in the course of 1 year, and I'm trying to wrap my head around how many decades we've lived since that 1 year ago. So much of it not just bad but horrific. This is certainly a major wrinkle. So our conversation obviously hooked on the attack in Doha. In the big scheme of things, you would think it's not a major event, right? This was an attempt to kill some people who probably deserved it, but I don't want anyone to die. But in terms of numbers of people who died, compared to anything happening in so many other places, including in Israel and Gaza, this is minute. But this does portend to the possibility of a shift in what has really been a breakneck speed of events. And so I think, the question that you raised earlier about how does this affect the Arab parties, given the weakening, at least temporary, of Iran and its access, that is a very important one. I take slightly less dramatically, what is Qatar going to do exactly now? I think that's a little less dramatic. But what does it mean for the other Arab parties? I don't know yet. And so for me, this is really a moment of uncertainty more than anything else. I know you're not allowed to say that as an analyst, certainly not in Washington, D.C. But to a large degree, I don't know what's coming next in this regard, which makes it, of course, also more interesting to a certain degree. Interesting sounds positive, and very little is positive right now. But to the degree that, at least analytically, it's interesting, this is that moment.
Well, we'll have to leave things on that note, and we'll certainly have to have you back to unpack the next developments as we see what unfolds going forward. That's all the time we have for this week. Thank you, Natan, for joining us on the program today.
Thank you very much. My pleasure.
And thank you as well to our listeners for tuning in. And finally, a big thanks to our production team for all of their work on this week's episode.
To find MEI's latest coverage of Israel, please visit our website, www.mei.edu. You can also follow MEI on X, Instagram, Facebook, and YouTube, and subscribe to our email newsletters for the latest analysis and information about upcoming events.
I'm Alistair Taylor.
And I'm Matthew Czekaj. We hope you listen in again next week.